At 58, a country music icon stood before cameras and declared his wife the greatest love he'd known. She'd rescued him from demons that nearly destroyed him. 18 months later, their marriage ended. No explosions, no tabloid drama, just quiet finality. What happened between the declaration and the divorce? The crisis that started everything. Most marriages begin with honeymoons. Theirs began with an emergency. Within 4 months of their 2006 wedding, the foundation cracked. An intervention. Family gathered. Professionals intervened. The groom who just said his vows was told he might not survive without immediate treatment. He later used one word to describe that moment: shattered. This wasn't gossip. He confirmed it himself years later at an industry tribute. Standing before Hollywood's elite, he admitted his world had imploded months into marriage. The woman everyone urged to leave was the only one who stayed. By every rational measure, she should have run. Friends advised it. The statistics were grim. Early marriage interventions rarely signal stability. They forecast years of anxiety, emotional exhaustion, and constant uncertainty. But she chose differently. That choice carried invisible weight. Staying didn't mean optimism. It meant accepting responsibility over safety. It meant understanding that normalcy might never arrive, that happiness could require permanent vigilance, and that her partner's survival might quietly become her life's work. He entered treatment for 3 months. 3 of their first 4 months as husband and wife were spent separated by locked facilities and therapy sessions, reckonings most couples never face. This crisis established something crucial: gratitude, guilt, dependence, devotion. When one partner becomes both spouse and savior, the emotional equilibrium shifts in ways that feel loving initially, but can become burdensome over time. He spoke openly about his terror that she'd leave. Her decision to stay fundamentally altered his understanding of love. Such devotion can inspire transformation, but it can also create quiet pressure to perpetually earn that initial choice. Their marriage didn't ease into depth. It was thrown into crisis immediately. The public saw glamour. Behind it, their foundation was built during emergency, not calm. The woman before the famous marriage, there was someone else who knew him without the mythology. For 8 years in the 1990s, before redemption narratives and carefully managed interviews, he was in a relationship that quietly explains more than most realize. She wasn't famous. She wasn't part of the industry. She met him when he was still uncertain, still building, still unstable. During nearly a decade together, she watched him construct a public persona that didn't match the private reality. He later called himself a hypocrite from that period. Not casually, uncomfortably. He was writing songs about devotion and honesty while privately struggling to embody either. The music sold an ideal. Reality was messier, addiction, insecurity, emotional distance, cycles of self-sabotage. When that 8-year relationship ended, it dissolved quietly. No public narrative, no mythology, just absence. But when news broke of his engagement to the famous actress, his ex spoke, not bitterly, but clearly. She warned that loving him meant accepting someone capable of extraordinary sincerity and profound self-destruction simultaneously. At the time, people dismissed it as jealousy. The narrative was simple. He'd grown. This time was different. For years, that seemed true. He stayed sober. He praised his wife endlessly, crediting her with saving him, publicly, consistently, almost ritualistically. But his ex wasn't predicting scandal. She was describing something quieter. The emotional labor required to love someone constantly working to outrun parts of themselves. The man who'd called himself a hypocrite hadn't stopped believing in love. He'd simply struggled to sustain it once initial intensity faded. That pattern didn't vanish with fame or marriage. It was managed, structured, contained. For years, his wife seemed willing to carry that weight, and he, in return, stayed publicly perfect. But perfection maintained for nearly 2 decades doesn't come from ease. It comes from effort, discipline, suppression. From choosing the right words, even when underlying feelings are complicated. The fragile architecture. By the mid-2010s, they were held up as one of entertainment's healthiest marriages. Stable, drama-free, almost aggressively solid. But the rules they built to protect that stability reveal something else. A marriage not coasting, but carefully engineered to avoid collapse. He once described their home life with a revealing metaphor, like a tower of blocks. One wrong move and everything could fall. At the time, it seemed like a joke about busy schedules. Looking back, it reads like a confession hiding in plain sight. Because that game isn't about strength, it's about balance under constant risk. Consider their rituals. The synchronized shower routine when apart, same time, different locations, framed as romantic connection across distance. But such rituals often emerge from anxiety, from needing to control connection when circumstances keep pulling you apart. Then, the no texting rule. They avoided texts because messages could be misread, tone lost. Instead, phone calls or silence. Again, framed as intentional communication. But texting isn't dangerous unless there's fear of misinterpretation, unless every word needs careful management. From the beginning, he framed her as his savior. That placed her in a position of emotional authority and him in permanent gratitude. Beautiful initially, but over time it creates quiet imbalance. When one partner is seen as the reason the other survived, the relationship transcends love. It becomes maintenance. About not disappointing the person who stood by you at your worst. About proving repeatedly that their faith wasn't misplaced. He spoke often about protecting the marriage. About being intentional. Admirable goals. But protection can become pressure, and intention can become self-surveillance. Every rule made sense individually. Together, they painted a picture of a marriage requiring constant calibration. Rules don't appear when things are easy. They appear when there's something to manage, when there's history to contain, when trust exists, but not effortlessly. The road that called him back. By late 2025, success came with a price he finally accepted. The marriage hadn't exploded. It unraveled in hotel rooms, tour buses, and sleepless early mornings when noise faded and he was alone with his thoughts. He later described the period with devastating honesty. Life on the road had made him lonely and miserable. For most artists, touring is exhausting but validating. For him, it had become something else, a place where success amplified isolation. He spoke about waking around 3:30 a.m. on tour, unable to sleep. Not from jet lag, but because his mind wouldn't quiet. Those hours became reckoning space. No audience, no obligations, just silence. That's when realization crept in. He wasn't just tired. He was unhappy in a deeper, more unsettling sense. The kind that doesn't disappear after rest. While he chased creative momentum on tour, she was reportedly struggling, worn down after years of holding the center, of being the steady one. That's the paradox. When one person stabilizes and starts pursuing growth again, the other often carries exhaustion from years of holding everything together. His loneliness wasn't just about distance. It followed him home. The problem wasn't geography. It was internal misalignment. By 2025, the emotional equation stopped balancing. He was no longer fighting to stay sober. That battle was won. No longer proving dependability. He'd done that. The question at 3:30 a.m. wasn't about survival. It was whether he was allowed to want more. A dangerous question in a marriage built on gratitude. The final mathematics. January 6, 2026. Legal documents. Cold. Sterile. Absolute. Buried in the filings. Custody arrangements that told the real story. He would spend 59 days yearly with their daughters. She would have 306. That ratio isn't statistics. It's a map of what they'd become. A father who'd become a guest in his own life. The legal acknowledgement that home was headquarters for one, a hotel for the other. Such arrangements don't happen by accident. They result from negotiations where one parent admits they simply cannot show up. Even as lawyers drafted the 306-day split, he continued using language of reverence. Called her the love of his life. Not past love. Definitive love. Full stop. But here's the hidden truth. Love alone is a terrible architect for a life. He'd reached a crossroads and chosen motion over stillness. The roar of arenas over silence of breakfast tables. The version of himself that only exists in spotlights. The tragedy. She could save him from addiction because addiction was an external enemy they could fight together. But fame isn't like substance abuse. It rewards you while hollowing you out. A slow, seductive hollowing that replaces difficult, quiet intimacy with cheap, loud validation from strangers. By 2025, he wasn't choosing between her and chaos. He was choosing between the woman he loved and the adrenaline that gave him identity. Calling her the love of his life wasn't a lie. It was an admission of failure. Love, as massive as it was, couldn't compete with the high of the road. That's the confession at 58. Not that the fire went out, but that he'd rather keep traveling than stay home, keeping it burning. At 58, the cost of being her partner finally exceeded the cost of being alone on the road.